1945. The war was ending, but for many, the echoes of surrender were louder than the guns that had fallen silent. In the fading summer heat of the Pacific, a group of Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries once loyal to the empire, were taken into American custody. The air was thick with exhaustion, disbelief and fear. For years they had been told what capture meant. Surrender was shame, imprisonment was dishonor, and mercy was a lie. But what they found behind the barbed wire fences of the American camps would challenge everything they had been taught. When the gates closed behind them, they didn't find cruelty waiting. They found order, they found calm, and most shockingly of all, they found food. The first trays handed to them were not rations of punishment, but meals of humanity. Warm bread, cooked vegetables, meat they hadn't tasted in years. Some refused to touch it at first, convinced it was a trick. Others wept silently as the aroma filled the room, a reminder of a life that felt a lifetime away. For these women, once proud servants of a fallen empire, this was not just food. It was the first sign that the war, and the hatred that fueled it, might truly be over. A strange silence filled the mess hall, broken only by the quiet clatter of metal spoons against tin plates. 1945. The world was quiet for the first time in years, but the silence did not feel like peace. It felt like aftermath. Across the Pacific, in the smoldering wake of war, transport trucks rolled through the dusty roads of newly secured islands. Inside them sat the defeated, Japanese female prisoners of war, women who had once worn uniforms of the rising sun, their insignia still faintly visible beneath the dirt and sweat. They were clerks, nurses, auxiliaries, the backbone of an empire that had fallen faster than anyone imagined. The trucks jolted over uneven terrain. Each bump reminded them that they were no longer soldiers, no longer free. Their eyes were empty, their expressions still clinging to a discipline that had lost its meaning. The sun burned overhead, but no one spoke. In the distance, the faint hum of American aircraft circled lazily in the sky, a sound that once meant terror. Now, it was simply a reminder that they were living under a different flag. When the convoy stopped, the women were ordered to step down. Dust swirled around their feet as the sound of boots and shouted orders filled the air. Ahead of them stood their destination, the American internment camp. It was not what they had imagined. The camp was enclosed by barbed wire, yes, but behind those fences stood neat rows of wooden barracks, whitewashed and aligned with military precision. There were no smokestacks, no signs of punishment or cruelty. The guards did not sneer, nor did they raise their rifles unnecessarily. They watched, alert but calm, as the prisoners were escorted through the gates. The women hesitated. They had been told stories, dark ones, that capture by Americans meant humiliation, that women would be mistreated, violated, or starved. Some even whispered that death was preferable to the shame of surrender. But the moment they crossed the threshold, the image began to fracture. The first thing they noticed was the smell. Not the stench of decay or neglect, but the faint aroma of food. Something cooking somewhere nearby. The second thing was the order. The ground had been swept clean. Paths marked with stones led between the barracks. Even the flagpoles stood perfectly upright, the American flag fluttering gently in the afternoon wind. It was almost civilized. One young woman, perhaps no more than 20, looked up for the first time. Her name was Sato. She had joined the auxiliary corps in the final desperate years of the war, more out of duty than belief. Her uniform hung loosely now, her face pale and tired. When she saw a group of American nurses walking across the yard, laughing, carrying supplies, she blinked in disbelief. Women, in uniform, free, confident, treated as equals among soldiers. The sight felt surreal. Back home, women were expected to serve, to endure silently. Yet here, even among the victors, they moved with ease and respect. As the Japanese women were led to the processing area, they stood in line, their postures rigid out of habit. A young American officer approached, clipboard in hand. He didn't bark orders, he spoke plainly, even offering water. His tone was firm, but not cruel. Through an interpreter, he instructed them to leave their belongings for inspection, promising that anything personal, letters, trinkets, keepsakes, would be returned. Suspicion lingered. They had no reason to trust him. But when he turned away to give instructions to his men, there was no hint of mockery, no cruel smile. Just procedure. Inside the registration tent, the air was thick with the scent of ink and sweat. One by one, the women gave their names, their ranks, their hometowns. Each word felt like a confession. Each signature, a quiet acceptance that the empire they served was gone. Outside, the sound of hammering echoed faintly, new fences being reinforced, supplies being unloaded. Yet there was no shouting, no chaos. Everything moved with quiet discipline. A few women exchanged glances. The calmness of the camp unsettled them more than open hostility would have. It didn't fit the image they had of the enemy. And that, perhaps, was the first seed of confusion that would later grow into something else. Understanding. As the day wore on, the heat softened. The shadows grew long and gold. The prisoners were finally escorted to their assigned barracks. Each structure was simple, wooden, windowed, equipped with bunks and even thin mattresses. There was no luxury, but there was dignity. Blankets had been neatly folded. Metal wash basins stood near the door. It was orderly, almost too orderly. One woman muttered under her breath, her voice trembling, "Why? Why would they treat us like this?" No one answered. They sat in silence, listening to the rhythmic clatter of utensils from the nearby mess hall, the faint sound of laughter. American soldiers talking casually among themselves drifted through the air. For the Japanese women, that laughter was the sound of something they could not yet comprehend: peace. When night fell, the camp lights came on one by one, bathing the grounds in a soft amber glow. The hum of generators filled the stillness. From the barracks windows, some prisoners watched the guards walking their rounds, rifles slung casually, not menacingly. The guards looked tired, not hateful. Inside, the women tried to sleep, but rest did not come easily. For years they had lived on edge, in fear, in propaganda, in the belief that the world outside Japan was cruel and barbaric. Now in captivity, that belief was being quietly dismantled. Sato lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She remembered her last day in Japan. The air raids, the flames, the sound of the emperor's voice announcing surrender. It had felt like the world collapsing. But here, far from home, among strangers who showed restraint instead of revenge, she felt something unexpected stirring inside her. Not comfort, not trust, but curiosity. Perhaps mercy was not weakness after all. The next morning began with a whistle and a voice calling the prisoners outside for roll call. The sun was barely up, painting the horizon in pink and gold. As they lined up, the women noticed the American soldiers standing opposite them, clipboards in hand, organized and efficient. The same officer from before gave orders, ensuring everyone was accounted for. When one woman stumbled from dizziness, an American medic stepped forward, offering her water and checking her pulse. The Japanese women froze. No one had expected that gesture. Compassion was not something they had been told to anticipate. That small act, so human, so simple, broke something inside them. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, but in the quiet way the medic handled her, with respect instead of condescension, something invisible shifted. Throughout the day, they were shown around the camp, the infirmary, the wash areas, the dining tents. Everything was functional, practical, and astonishingly clean. The prisoners realized that their captors lived under the same conditions. There was no luxury, no superiority, just a sense of shared discipline. It was disorienting. By evening, they gathered once more near their barracks. A light breeze moved through the camp, carrying with it the smell of freshly baked bread. It was a smell that stirred memories of home kitchens, of childhood, of a world before war. The women stood silently, looking toward the mess hall. Inside, American cooks were preparing meals, not just for their own men, but for the prisoners as well. It was the first real sign that something extraordinary was happening. Sato glanced at another woman beside her, a former communications clerk named Heine. Their eyes met briefly. No words passed between them, but the question lingered in both their minds. Why would the enemy feed us like this? The answer would come later. But for now, the confusion itself was a kind of awakening. That night, as the lights went out, the camp fell silent again. Yet it was not the fearful silence of arrival. It was a different kind, uneasy, yes, but also thoughtful. The women began to realize that survival here did not depend on obedience alone, but on understanding a new kind of discipline, one built on respect rather than fear. And as the stars spread across the dark Pacific sky, the women of Japan, once servants of empire, now prisoners of peace, lay in their bunks wondering if perhaps, in this strange and ordered captivity, they might discover something far rarer than freedom. They might discover their humanity. The day began with stillness, a kind of silence that carried both uncertainty and fatigue. The Japanese women awoke in their new surroundings, unsure what the next hour would bring. Their uniforms, once symbols of loyalty and pride, now looked like reminders of a war that had ended without glory. The air was heavy with both shame and disbelief. They were prisoners now, but the reality of captivity had not yet taken shape. Outside, American soldiers moved with the same disciplined rhythm as before. Boots crunching on gravel, orders exchanged in calm voices, the mechanical hum of military life continuing like clockwork. But beneath that order, something different was taking form, something subtle. A bell rang across the camp, not an alarm but a signal. The women stood at attention automatically, their instincts still bound to the routines of their former service. Then came the voice of the interpreter, clear and deliberate. "You will be served breakfast. Follow the guards to the mess hall." Breakfast. For a moment the word felt alien. Food, in war, had been nothing but a ration, a necessity stripped of comfort. In their last months of service, these women had eaten whatever scraps they could find, rice mixed with grass, boiled roots. Sometimes nothing at all. To hear that a meal was being served to prisoners seemed absurd, but they obeyed. The group walked in silence toward a large canvas structure at the center of the camp. The air was thick with the scent of something warm, unfamiliar but comforting. The closer they came, the more vivid the smell became. Baked bread, perhaps, and something savory simmering in deep pots. When they entered the mess hall, time seemed to stop. Long wooden tables stretched across the room, spotless and arranged in perfect rows. Metal trays waited at each seat. American cooks, men in white aprons stained with flour and grace, moved behind the serving line. The scene felt impossibly normal. The Japanese women hesitated at the entrance, uncertain if this was truly meant for them. One of the guards motioned forward. "Please," the interpreter said gently.
"Sit."
They did, awkwardly, every movement stiff and cautious. A few kept their hands folded tightly in their laps, unwilling to touch anything until ordered to. The clatter of trays echoed softly, followed by the sound of ladles dipping into soup. Steam rose into the air, carrying the aroma of chicken and vegetables, a simple dish but rich, nourishing, and impossibly foreign to their war-starved senses. When the first tray was placed in front of them, the women stared as if looking at a mirage. There was soup, bread, a small portion of meat, and even an apple. None of it made sense. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't neglect. It was care. Some believed it was a trick, a calculated deception meant to test their reactions. Others whispered to each other that perhaps the food was poisoned, or tainted, or somehow unfit for Japanese prisoners. After years of propaganda, kindness felt like danger, but hunger was stronger than fear. One woman, trembling slightly, picked up her spoon. She lifted it to her lips. The warmth hit her tongue, and for the first time in months, her body recognized nourishment. She froze, the taste too rich, too real. Her eyes welled with tears before she could stop them. Across the table another woman followed, then another. Soon the faint sound of spoons clinking against metal bowls filled the air. Quiet, rhythmic, almost sacred. The guards stood at a respectful distance, watching silently. No one rushed them, no one shouted. For the American cooks, it was just another day's duty. For the women, it was a revelation. Every bite told a story they didn't know how to process. The bread was soft, not the dry, crumbling kind they'd grown used to. The soup was hearty, filled with real meat and vegetables. Even the apple, so simple, so ordinary, felt like a luxury. Its sweetness hit like a memory from a world that no longer existed. Some of them began to cry softly, heads bowed so the guards wouldn't see. Not out of shame, but from something deeper. The shock of being shown mercy when they had prepared themselves for pain. A young woman at the far end of the table whispered, "Why would they feed us like this?" No one answered. The interpreter, watching quietly from the side, noticed the confusion on their faces. He spoke softly, in halting Japanese. "It is American policy. Prisoners are to be treated humanly." The words hung in the air, humanly. It was not a concept they had ever associated with captivity. In their own army, prisoners were barely acknowledged, often starved or executed to avoid burdening the system. To treat an enemy with kindness, that was weakness. And yet, here they were, fed, clothed, and spoken to with decency. The realization felt heavier than chains. As the meal continued, the atmosphere began to shift. The rigid postures softened. Shoulders that had been stiff with tension began to ease. One woman dared to ask for more soup, her voice timid, almost childlike. The American cook behind the counter smiled faintly and filled her bowl without hesitation. She bowed deeply, unsure how else to respond. He nodded in return, a small, wordless exchange that bridged two worlds that had been at war only weeks before. That gesture, simple, quiet, human, would stay with her for the rest of her life. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The camp, usually marked by the sounds of drills and orders, seemed gentler now. The smell of food drifted through the air, carried by the breeze beyond the fences, as if even the earth itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. Inside, something subtle but powerful was happening. The women were beginning to see their captors not as monsters, but as men. They noticed the wariness in their faces, the way they carried themselves, tired but composed. These were soldiers too, shaped by duty and fatigue, not by hatred. One of the Japanese women, older than most, looked down at her meal and thought of her son. He had been a soldier in the Imperial Army. She did not know if he was alive or dead. She imagined him in some distant camp, hungry, frightened, and for the first time she allowed herself to hope that somewhere, perhaps, someone might be feeding him like this. That thought broke her. Silent tears fell into her bowl as she kept eating. The sound of utensils continued, quiet, constant, strangely rhythmic. The interpreter noticed that the fear in the room was fading, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. It wasn't comfort. Not yet. But it was the beginning of peace. When the meal ended, the women were instructed to leave their trays at the end of the line. They did so carefully, almost reverently, as if handling sacred objects. Some bowed slightly to the cooks before stepping outside, unsure if such gestures were allowed or even noticed. But the Americans noticed. And though they didn't understand the words, they understood the meaning. As the prisoners stepped back into the open sunlight, their eyes adjusted to the brightness. The camp looked different now. The fences were still there, the guards still posted. But the world beyond those barriers no longer seemed so cruel. They walked slowly, some talking quietly among themselves. The interpreter overheard fragments of disbelief. They gave us real food. It was warm. They didn't shout. They smiled. Each sentence was like a thread, weaving a new narrative that none of them had expected to live through. That night, in the barracks, the women lay awake again. But this time, they were not haunted by fear. They were haunted by kindness. The taste of that meal lingered, and with it, questions that had no easy answers. What did it mean to be treated as human by an enemy? What did it mean to accept generosity from those they had been told were heartless? And what did it say about everything they had believed, everything they had been taught to die for? In the dim light, Sato sat up quietly, holding the small piece of bread she had saved from dinner. She couldn't bring herself to eat it yet. It was soft and fragrant, a reminder that not all victories were won by force. She stared at it for a long time, then whispered a quiet prayer. Not to any god of war, but to something greater. Perhaps forgiveness. The camp around her was silent, except for the distant hum of a generator and the occasional murmur of guards changing shifts. In that stillness, she realized something profound. The food had not just fed their bodies, it had disarmed their souls. For the first time since the surrender, she didn't feel like a captive. She felt alive. Days later, she would remember the faces of the men who served her. Not as victors, not as soldiers, but as humans. And in that recognition lay the first fragile thread of reconciliation between two nations that had torn each other apart. In the simplest act of nourishment, the seeds of peace had been planted, quiet, unseen, but undeniable. The days that followed moved slowly, like pages turning in a book that no one expected to keep reading. The war had ended, but its ghost still lingered in every shadow of the camp. For the Japanese women, each sunrise brought both relief and confusion. They woke not to the sound of bombs or commands, but to the whistle that signaled morning roll call, to the measured rhythm of footsteps outside, and to the strange peace that hung heavy in the air. Routine became their anchor. At dawn they lined up, counted, inspected. Then came breakfast, always warm, always enough. Afterward they were assigned light duties, cleaning, organizing supplies, tending the gardens that bordered the outer fence. None of it felt like punishment. It felt useful, and that, more than anything, unsettled them. They had been told that defeat meant disgrace. That capture erased honor. Yet here, in this unlikely place, they were beginning to feel something that had been missing for years. Purpose without fear. It started subtly. The silence that once defined the camp began to fracture. At first it was only whispers during chores, soft exchanges between bunks at night. A few dared to ask about the Americans, where they came from, what kind of people they were. Curiosity replaced terror, and curiosity is always the beginning of understanding. One morning, as the prisoners washed their clothes near the water barrels, an American nurse walked by. Her name tag read, Turner. She smiled politely and greeted them with a simple, "Good morning." The words were foreign, the tone gentle. None of the women replied, they simply stared, unsure if responding was permitted. Turner didn't insist. She just kept walking, humming quietly to herself. But that one moment left a mark. Later that night, one of the younger prisoners, Yumi, asked the interpreter how to say, "Good morning," in English. The next day, when Turner passed again, Yumi whispered it shyly, her accent rough but sincere. The nurse turned, surprised, then smiled even wider. "Good morning," she answered softly. The exchange lasted only seconds, but for the women, it felt monumental. It was the first bridge built not by policy or duty, but by courage, the courage to speak across the line that once divided enemies. In the evenings, the prisoners gathered outside their barracks to watch the sky. The camp sat on the edge of a wide plain, where the horizon seemed endless. Some of the women began to talk about home, their villages, their families, the sounds of summer festivals that once echoed through narrow streets. Others listened in silence, afraid that remembering would hurt too much. Then, one evening, laughter broke the stillness. It was small and uncertain, but unmistakable. Two women had been trying to teach each other how to mimic the Americans' way of saluting. A clumsy, exaggerated gesture that made them giggle uncontrollably. The sound startled everyone. Heads turned. For a brief moment, the camp came alive with something long-forgotten joy. That laughter traveled. Guards nearby glanced over, but none interfered. They simply watched from a distance, a few smiling to themselves. They understood that such moments did more for order and peace than any amount of discipline ever could. Day by day, the prisoners changed. Their postures softened. Their eyes, once clouded with defiance and despair, began to show light again. They still bowed their heads when addressed, but not out of fear anymore. It was habit slowly losing its weight. In the mess hall, conversations became longer. The Americans learned fragments of Japanese. Thank you, good, enough. The women, in turn, learned words that expressed gratitude. Each meal felt less like an exchange between captor and captive, and more like a quiet, shared ritual. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled across the camp. Rain battered the roofs and turned the dirt paths into rivers of mud. When lightning struck near one of the fences, several tents collapsed. Without orders, the Japanese women rushed to help the guards secure them. For a moment, soldiers and prisoners worked side by side, pulling ropes, holding canvas, shouting directions that transcended language. When it was over, everyone stood drenched but smiling, breathless with adrenaline. No one spoke of loyalty or surrender. They simply nodded to each other, humans who had faced the same storm. Later that night, as they dried their clothes by the barrack heaters, the women talked about the day. "We helped them," one said in disbelief, "and they thanked us." The others nodded silently, trying to understand what that meant. Perhaps the war really had ended, not only outside the camp, but inside them. Weeks passed, and the small garden near the mess hall began to bloom. Vegetables grew in neat rows, planted by both prisoners and guards. It had started as a simple project to supplement rations, but it became something more, a symbol of shared survival. Every seed sown was a gesture of faith in a future that none of them could yet imagine. Sato, who had once refused to speak at all, began volunteering to help in the kitchen. She learned how to prepare bread under the guidance of an American cook named Miller. At first, they communicated through gestures and broken words. Over time, they understood each other through rhythm. Knead, fold, bake. The smell of fresh bread became her favorite part of the day. Sometimes Miller would hum while he worked. Old songs from back home. The melodies were simple, but they carried warmth. One afternoon, Sato joined him softly with a Japanese tune of her own. The two songs overlapped for a moment, blending into something haunting and beautiful. It was gone in seconds, but it felt like peace made audible. Even the guards noticed the change. Reports to superiors mentioned improved morale, cleaner barracks, fewer incidents. The women who had arrived broken were rebuilding themselves quietly, piece by piece, with every act of kindness they received and returned. At night, when the generators hummed and the camp lights flickered, the women sometimes shared stories aloud. Not all were hopeful. Some spoke of loss, of burned homes and vanished brothers, but speaking itself was healing. Their voices no longer trembled with fear. They had begun to reclaim ownership of their own sorrow, and in that reclamation they discovered dignity again. The Americans, too, were changing. For many of them, this was their first close encounter with the enemy as individuals. The women in the camp were no longer faceless adversaries. They were people with names, laughter, and tears. Soldiers who had once fought with hatred found themselves wondering about the families of these prisoners, about the cities they came from. The line between us and them blurred further every day. One guard, Private Harris, wrote in his letter home, "They're nothing like we were told. They're just tired souls trying to survive, same as us. You can see it in their eyes when they eat, when they work. It makes you think about what war really means." That realization spread like quiet wildfire. Humanity, once buried under layers of propaganda and pain, began to reassert itself. One evening, a concert was held for the American troops. Just a small gathering near the recreation tent, a few soldiers with guitars. The music drifted across the camp, reaching the women's barracks. They listened through the open windows, captivated. Without understanding the words, they understood the feeling home. Later that night, one of the Japanese women, Hana, whispered that they should sing something too. At first, no one dared. Then she began softly, an old folk song from Kyoto, slow and mournful. One by one, others joined. Their voices rose through the quiet night, weaving with the faint echoes of American guitars in the distance. Two languages, two melodies, sharing the same sky. The guards didn't stop them. They simply stood watch, listening. One leaned against the fence, his eyes closed. It was, in its own quiet way, a prayer. By late autumn, the camp no longer felt like a place of punishment. It felt like a space suspended between past and future. A fragile peace built on meals, smiles, and shared labor. The women began writing letters again, now allowed to contact families back home. Some learned that their towns had been reduced to ash. Others learned that loved ones had survived. The news brought both joy and grief, but even grief felt bearable here. They had learned that kindness could coexist with sorrow. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There were no speeches, no declarations. It happened in moments too small to notice unless you looked closely. A soldier helping a prisoner fix her shoe, a woman returning a borrowed pen with a grateful nod, laughter shared over a clumsy English word. It was humanity, rebuilding itself one gesture at a time. Months later, when the order came that many of the prisoners would soon be repatriated, the news spread quietly. The women felt a strange ache, not the eagerness they had expected, but something more complicated. They were going home, yes, but part of them knew they were leaving behind the very place where they had rediscovered what it meant to be human. On their final morning, as they gathered their few belongings, the same American cooks prepared one last meal for them: bread, soup, and fruit, just like the first day. The women ate slowly, savoring every bite. When they finished, they stood, bowed deeply toward the kitchen and whispered, "Thank you," in English. The cooks and guards stood still, unsure how to respond. Then one by one they saluted. No words were needed. As the trucks rolled out, the women looked back at the camp fading into the distance. The neat rows of barracks, the waving flags, the smoke rising gently from the kitchens. For months, those fences had defined their world. Now beyond them lay an uncertain freedom. But they carried something with them that no one could take away. The memory of compassion where none was expected, of mercy given without demand, of strangers who taught them that peace begins not with treaties, but with simple acts of care. That night, when darkness fell across the Pacific, the camp stood silent once more. But somewhere, in the hearts of those who had lived behind its fences, a quiet light continued to burn. It was the light of transformation, the proof that even in the ruins of war, kindness could still find its way through.